As Tom Robertson mentioned, this would not have happened the way it did without the support of Microsoft and Bill Gates. And so we were thinking about what would be a special way to celebrate the opening. And Kevin Rudd has been instrumental in reforming a large part of the Asia Society over the last few years, really creating a very energetic policy institute. And so we thought, oh, since Kevin was at the dinner with Bill and Brad Smith that led to the financial support to launch this event, it'd be fun to have them come back on stage together and actually talk about that, as well as obviously a few other topics. There's not a lot going on in the world, so we had to come up with all sorts of interesting ideas for them to talk about. But I think we're in pretty good shape. So with that, I'm going to introduce first our moderator, Lingling Wei from the Wall Street Journal. Lingling came to the U.S. in 1999, stayed, and is really one of the preeminent reporters on all things related to Chinese domestic policy and domestic politics. So please welcome Lingling. The next person that's coming out on stage, if you don't know who he is, you do not belong in this room. I'd like to ask Bill Gates to come out. The next gentleman has a strange accent, and I'm incredibly jealous of the head of hair that he still possesses. Kevin is one of the world's true Chinese scholars, and a former prime minister and former ambassador, a former head of the Asia Society and current ambassador to the United States. And finally, Daniel Russel. So Danny was in the State Department for a number of years. And he and I were talking this morning. You have seminal things that occurred in your career. And one very early in his career, he worked directly for Mike Mansfield, who is by any measure in the State Department and the Senate one of the great heroes of the United States. So with that, I'll let Lingling kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for the great introduction. And I'm super excited to be here to help celebrate the launch of Asia Society Seattle Center and to moderate this superstar panel. So I understand we only have very limited amount of time, but given the knowledge each one of those panelists has, I'm just going to go right to it. I have the honor to ask some initial questions to each of the four panelists, and then I'll make sure we set aside enough time for the audience to get your questions in. So I'll just kick this off. Bill, this Asia Society for a very long time has played a very important role in terms of facilitating understanding between the China and the United States, the most important bilateral relationship of our time. So I'm just wondering, what do you think this Seattle Center, what do you expect the Seattle Center to contribute to that cause, the long-running cause of the Asia Society in terms of facilitating understanding between the United States and China?
Well, hopefully Seattle, who has great interest in U.S. China relationships, can play a constructive role. I mean, we have Boeing, Microsoft, Gates Foundation, where for each of those, the relationship with China's very important. Our foundation has had an office there for over 15 years, and it's the second biggest science R&D budget in the world after the United States, and in many ways more focused on helping countries develop things like agriculture. And so important for us. Historically, both President Xi and President Hu, before they went to their visits to Washington, D.C., happened to come here, and I think got a good reception and an effort to try and bridge whatever the gaps are. So it's great to have Asia Society here in Seattle.
Thank you. We will get to your recent meeting with President Xi a little bit later. Kevin, what a journey you have had just in recent years, from serving as Australia's Prime Minister to running the Asia Society Policy Institute, and to most recently becoming Australia's ambassador to the U.S. What is the transition like for you? How's Washington treating you? And how big a factor is China in terms of shaping your work schedule every day?
Well, it's kind of fun going to Washington. I was in fear and trepidation. It'd be a bit like going from Sydney to Canberra. And if those of you have visited Canberra, in the past, many of us have described it as the ruination of a good sheep property, otherwise our national capital. But I can't say that publicly, and we're among friends. Washington is a great city. But if your interest is public policy, if your interest is how we navigate what Bill just talked about, which is this phenomenally complex U.S. China relationship, given all the geopolitics, all the geoeconomics, all of the technology competitiveness which now exists between the two countries and the two economies, then Washington's a great place to be. But to add one footnote, and why we're all here in Seattle today, it is just an enormous joy to see this Centre of the Asia Society launched, and Gary and Margaret and the rest of the team kicking this off, because this provides a very important portal into the US-China relationship. Tech here is mainstream economy. Tech is central to China's economy. Go to Shenzhen, go to Seattle, you're looking at similarly symbiotic relationships. And so will that work to the good of the relationship, or will it work in the other direction? Depends on all of us. But this therefore supplements enormously our insight into navigating what is a phenomenally complex relationship. And it will either land in a way where we can navigate the 20s and 30s peacefully and with common prosperity, or it will go in the reverse direction. So the reason for going to Washington is to be part of that process.
Sure. In China, how often the topic China comes up during your conversations in Washington?
Usually before I get to the Rice Krispies of a morning. So China comes up over the yogurt just to start the day. And then intensifies over lunch. And certainly when you get to your 6 p.m. Manhattan, it's really going strong. One of the things I love about America, by the way, Gary and Bill, is you have a really Puritan culture at some levels until you get to 6 p.m. Okay, so nobody, let's say, drop of alcohol touch their lips until 6 p.m. and then it's on for young and old in this country. They go from nothing to the hard stuff. So that's my experience in DC as well. Of course, being a teetotaler, not. I just observe.
Brilliant. Gary, you have invested in China for so many years, a lot of Chinese tech companies in particular. So do you think China has become, quote unquote, uninvestable, as many have said? What are the biggest risks you see of investing in China these days, and what are the signs that are still giving you hope in terms of investing in that market?
Well, first, now you know why we miss Kevin so much at the Asia Society. In terms of investability or not, I think it's a very nice trite phrase to throw out. China's uninvestable. The reality is far more nuanced than that. And for example, for a firm, if you look at the firm that I started, Qiming, we only invest in China for China. So we have 110 people there, and we invest in a broad range of technology. We're the largest healthcare investor in China, and from a venture capital perspective. Those businesses are doing just fine, because what a lot of the restrictions have done is actually made it harder for the foreign competitors to compete with the Chinese startups. You also have the situation on enterprise software where the Chinese government doesn't want any US enterprise software. in China, and they're trying desperately to replace all of it, which is very difficult. They're trying to replace U.S. Semiconductor equipment, U.S. semiconductors. So if you're investing in core technology areas in China, it remains very investable. If you're a larger company and you're more subject to the political winds than startups would be. Again, all of our startup CEOs are Chinese. I'm the only foreigner in the 110 people within Qiming. So it's really a Chinese firm investing in China. And for the firms like that, I think it's eminently investable and will continue to be so for quite some time.
Thank you. A lot of us here today are trying to contribute any way we can to the U.S.-China relationship. But we know that this relationship has slipped to the lowest point since the 70s. So, and Danny, as a former diplomat, senior foreign services officer, you have dealt with the Chinese for so many years, and you know the Biden administration also very well. What is the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship going forward in your view, especially given that most recently there seems to be some signs of warming up in bilateral ties, contacts, if not the relationship per se?
Well, it's hard to tell when you've hit bottom, and it's not at all clear that the relationship has leveled out. There's a certain amount of wishful thinking, perhaps. It's a good thing. Secretary Blinken, Secretary Raimondo, Secretary Yellen has made the trip to Beijing. Talking is definitely in order. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are a lot of serious structural problems in the U.S.-China relationship, and right now we each seem to have succumbed to a kind of full-spectrum rivalry where the U.S. side is absolutely convinced that we know what China's diabolical plan to subvert the global order looks like, and thinks the Chinese are equally convinced that they know what our diabolical plan to contain and undermine and overthrow the Communist Party looks like. So we're at loggerheads. The structural problems aside, what really matters is human agency. Leaders are people, governments are made up of people, and the decisions that our communities, our societies, our leaders, and particularly in the case of, I think, both of our systems, the top leader makes, these matter. And so there's real urgency in getting to work at every level of government.
I see. Thank you, Danny. It's a little depressing to think that it seems that we're at the bottom, but it's not clear that how, much lower this relationship
Well, there's
can
ways
go.
to go yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, now we're turning to Bill for some optimism, I hope. Bill, you are the first American President Xi Jinping met with this year. First of all, do you know why you were picked to be the first?
Well, I've seen President Xi, a number of times. As I said, when he came to Seattle, Melinda and I had lunch with him and his wife. I knew his wife for Madam Peng for quite some time because she was the HIV/TB ambassador, both domestically and internationally. And so, the foundation is there. We partner with a lot of health and agricultural innovation in China, where the goal is to help the low-income countries, primarily in Africa. And so the cooperation with the foundation has been pretty impressive. New TB drugs, new seeds, and so I was pleased to. We had a great meeting and a nice lunch banquet with the president and Madam Peng. So we touched on a lot of different areas. I may have benefited somewhat, that they were drawing a contrast, but the work is to help the poorest countries, and hopefully that is still an area of win-win type cooperation.
Right. So, you spent many hours with President Xi and his team and his wife. What were your biggest takeaways from those meetings? As you know, China's economy right now is experiencing really a crisis of sorts. And have you got a sense of, urgency on their parts? What are the senses you're getting from them in terms of the challenges they're facing?
Well, many people who watch China predicted every year for the last 20 years that the Chinese economy, would slow down. Finally, those people will be vindicated. 20 times wrong, they're going to, and find, 2.5% growth, which, if you take out pandemic recovery, that would be a very robust GDP growth for any G7 countries. And so, yes, they have challenges. It's not like the U.S. doesn't have challenges as well. If people enjoy the fact China has challenges, great, they can get some enjoyment out of that. It's not great for the world economy because Chinese growth has been an engine of opportunity and help the entire world. So, he and I didn't discuss GDP figures or anything. We discussed things like polio and eradication and how China can help with that, and agricultural innovation and how you get the new science in such a way that everybody feels comfortable that those things are safe and should be adopted. So we pretty quickly got into particular areas where there's mutual opportunity. And hopefully there's a broad set of issues that are still win-win between the two countries. As you get to the mistrust and low level of exchange that we've gotten into, even those areas can be eclipsed. And so being a voice for where, something that's outside of the small yard, high fence still should be maintained, he and I explored topics that all fit into that framework.
Thank you. Just curious, one follow-up question. Because China, like the rest of the world, experienced such great challenges from the pandemic, COVID pandemic. And we all know that Chinese vaccines are lacking when compared to Western vaccines. Did he or anybody on his team ask you or your advice on how to help China develop more effective vaccines in terms of that kind of cooperation?
Yeah, so our foundation is very involved with the Chinese vaccine industry because getting really cheap vaccines at volume across all the different diseases, that's probably the primary thing that people know that the Gates Foundation does. So China makes a lot of polio vaccine, Japanese encephalitis vaccine, the best HPV vaccine, the lowest cost will be coming out of China. The manufacturers we work with there are moving up to use mRNA type approaches. In fact, the difficulty of entry, both for African countries or China, to build mRNA factories is going to be very cheap. We're doing the foundation's doing a big session about that at the UN General Assembly week next week. And so it's great for the world to have lots of capacity. The Chinese vaccines actually weren't that bad. They were a tiny bit less good, but a huge benefit if you got great coverage with the elderly. And they are cycling to keep their COVID vaccines up to date, in fact. So the current situation is that they're very serious about those vaccines. So that is an area where India does great work, Korea does great work, Japan does great work, and we need that global capacity so that when you have sudden demand like in a pandemic or just on a normal year, you're paying a group called Gavi that that foundation funded with various countries, it funds buying vaccines for all the children of the world. And because the prices of vaccines come down because of the way we work with these manufacturers, we're able to add new vaccines without increasing the Gavi funding. And so, for example, this HPV that prevents cervical cancer is now being added in to what every, in this case, girl, will have access to without us having to raise additional money. And the Chinese manufacturers are central to that. Because that's all going super well, I didn't talk with him about vaccines. We work with the health ministry and the big companies, some of which are government owned, and some like Sinovac, and some of which are private. We work with both types of companies.
Great to hear. Very important for all of us to know that that kind of cooperation still exists. Thank you. Kevin, want to ask you about Australia's experience of dealing with China. Over the past few years, we're seeing quite a few back and forth, right? China initially banned Australian beef, Australian wine. We don't get good Shiraz in Beijing anymore. And then just because your leadership
you do
called
it
for,
Hai.
yeah. And then most recently, we saw China dialing back some of the economic coercive measures against Australia. So what, in your view, did Canberra do right to get China to back off? Was there a trade-off or sort? You know, Australia backed off on certain things in exchange for Beijing backing off. And anything you think from Australia's experiences that might offer some lessons for Washington?
Yeah, well, the thing that diplomats never do, and given that I'm supposed to have become one again, is provide public advice to their host government. So I'll beg off on that one. But to on the broader question, which frankly Danny and Bill have been getting at, it's about, as Danny said, political agency. We are not destined to a relationship of crisis, conflict, and war between China and the United States or between China and any other US allies. We are not. Political leaders can make a huge difference, as they have done in history. Flip over to what Bill was talking about is one area, given the current dynamics of the relationship, where there is ample scope for positive engagement lies in public health within China, globally, where the demands speak for themselves. And so being a realist, and that's me, understanding where the relationship is now at, which is the worst it has been in a half a century, understanding at the same time that there is political agency in both capitals to make a difference, and understanding also that global public health, for example, provides an enormous ground for active and mutually beneficial collaboration. It's kind of where we should be going. Bill ran through the list, which his foundation, people like Gavi and people like the Global Foundation and others have been doing. It's been my privilege as formerly the Prime Minister of Australia to work with Gates Foundation and those institutions, as Bill has walked in the door and asked me for a cheque, and so usually with great effect. But beyond that, one of the things the Asia Society is doing is collaborative work between China and the United States on the accelerated trials of forward-leaning cancer treatment drugs. China has the largest number of cancer sufferers in the world. It's a big country. Dietary patterns have changed, smoking, etc. And so if you're looking for two huge population catchments on which now to trial cancer treatment drugs, it's China and the United States. What's the practical idea here? There's a proposal called Project Orbis, which Asia Society Policy Institute's been working on for a long time now, which has already been agreed between the United States and a whole bunch of other Western countries on rapid cancer drug treatment trials and rapidly bringing them to market. How do we bring China into that, given all of the pre-existing tensions on genomics and the rest? It's a practical challenge, but I think political leadership can make the difference.
On the Australia stuff, we just decided to stop shouting at each other. And because I have a simple view of life, which is shouting usually doesn't get you very far. And so it doesn't automatically, therefore, as a consequence, resolve fundamental and structural questions. Australia is proudly an ally of the United States. We share fundamental national security interests in common with the U.S. across East Asia and the West Pacific. There are, therefore, structural issues of genuine national security disagreement between ourselves and the PRC. But that does not preclude us from having a fundamentally engaged relationship across the economy and other domains like public health as well. We can walk and chew gum in this relationship, both us and other allies of the United States, plus the US itself.
Thank you. Both Bill and Kevin talked about some few areas of cooperation, and hopefully, that kind of thing will continue. But, for the overall relationship, we definitely have seen, getting worse, and especially in certain areas, the de-risking, the trend of de-risking, the trend of decoupling, like it or not, is happening. We look at the data for direct investment in China. Used to be $100 billion a quarter. Most recent quarter, it collapsed to $5 billion. So Gary, as a member of the U.S. business community, how would you evaluate Biden administration's China policy? You think the most recent
softball.
Yeah, softball. And what would you advise them to do?
So I think I'll just repeat what Bill and Kevin said. So the thing about policy is, if you're going to have a policy, you want the policy to be effective. And you want to put the work into the policy being effective. And so there are a couple aspects, particularly related to the area that I'm in venture capital. And so I've spent a lot of time in DC this year, which actually I have enjoyed. And I've had a chance to talk to the people on the China Committee, Gallagher and Krishnamurti and their team, Secretary Raimondo's staff, Secretary Yellen's staff, and so on. And the thing that strikes me is there are always two things that you run into that are problematic when you talk about restricting money going into venture capital and going into innovation in China. There is an idea in DC that money that comes from America is more valuable than money that comes from, let's pick Saudi Arabia. And that probably was true 18 or 20 years ago, when the people in starting venture capital firms in China largely were trained by American firms. They were over there. So the expertise of investing, the expertise of identifying technology trends and developments was something that China learned from the United States. Now 99.5% of all the VCs in China are Chinese, and it is a completely localized industry. So the idea that somehow preventing money from going to a fund is going to prevent a Chinese general partner or a Chinese investor from finding a great deal, that's simply not the case. And so that's one fallacy. And so you have a substitution effect occurring where very large amounts of money are now flowing from the Middle East into venture capital firms that are doing investments in China, just substituting for US dollars that Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, Duke, et cetera, can no longer deploy or may no longer be able to deploy. We don't know what the final rules will be, but those are the kind of restrictions we think about. So there's that aspect. The other aspect that I find even more disappointing is the idea that China is a centrally planned economy. When, having done business there now for 20-something years and looking at the various large-scale development projects that they had, the success rate is not high, especially around complex systems. The initial automobile industry projects in China, the 863 program, the 963 program, were actually quite dismal failures. And then they did the forced cross-licensing to build development. But you still would never buy an internal combustion engine car from China overseas. They never had any foreign penetration. It wasn't until you went to EVs and there's radically simplified systems where they're now at a cost basis and manufacturing basis really expanding. So there's in DC, and I get it, if you're in DC, you want to think that there's a country where all that centralized brain power is simply directing what Chinese entrepreneurs and Chinese business people do. Nothing could be further from the truth. there's not a single entrepreneur in the Qiming universe that wakes up thinking, how do I help the government today? I 100%, I'll guarantee it. I just will guarantee you that. But it's a good fantasy if you're a government official to think that somehow that's where the intellectual power and innovation is. And I'll just tell one quick story and pass it back. About a few years ago, the NDRC, which is one of National Development Resource Council, one of China's major state bodies, came to us and said, we would like to invest in a fund with you to do really innovative healthcare. So the senior people are in the room, and they said, we want cutting edge gene therapy, cell therapy, gene sequencing, et cetera, et cetera. And they leave the room, and we're all looking at each other going, this is great. Then their lieutenants came in, and they said, yeah, what those guys said is fine, but don't lose any money. Can't do both. You can't invest in really cutting edge technology, whether it's healthcare or semiconductors, AI, et cetera, without running the risk of losing money. So there's always this dichotomy. So don't look to the Chinese government in Beijing for where the Chinese economy and technology is going. Look to the entrepreneurs. And it's been a very frustrating part of the conversation with DC to actually, this is now 3 to 4 years having this conversation.
But the entrepreneurs these days are very discouraged, not because of the U.S. policy, mostly because China's own policy, right?
Well, so it's a little bit of both, actually. They're discouraged by the U.S. policy, too, because the U.S. was always the beacon of this is what a free market and free and development could be. And a lot of them had the aspirations of doing business overseas. And so that has become more difficult. I think much to our own detriment, frankly. When you look at who runs Silicon Valley companies, who starts companies, the Indian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora are disproportionately represented in terms of the founders, CTOs, et cetera. So we're actually doing ourselves a great disservice by discouraging those folks from coming here and starting businesses. I would say that it's been overplayed, the impact on the Chinese technology sector of the Chinese government by the Chinese government policy. You have to look at who they went after. They went after Jack Ma and Alibaba because Jack had created a school of Jack Ma thought. Really bad idea in the era of Xi Jinping thought to have a school of Jack Ma thought. The Chinese government was extremely concerned by the fact that the young people were embracing entrepreneurs. They were admiring business people, not the government. That was a significant issue. So they went after Alibaba, they went after Tencent, Baidu a little bit, ByteDance a little bit. It really was not a broad-based crackdown on the venture capital funded startups. And in fact, if you said, okay, every one of your companies that gets to 10 or 20 billion will have a lot of government impact, I'd say, great. We don't have that many companies that ever get to be worth 10 or 20 billion dollars. So I think that actually has been overstated. We do not see within the entrepreneurial community in China we don't see less drive, we don't see less ambition. What we see is far more circumspection in what they're going to say publicly. And that's just an IQ test at this point.
Yeah, that's probably one of the reasons why China, hasn't had a Bill Gates. Because you can't speak your mind. I think it's very discouraging in certain level. It reminds me of an entrepreneur recently told me that, the Chinese people, we do care about freedom. Number one freedom, we care about financial freedom. So Danny, you have been to China and countries in Southeast Asia in recent months. What are your impressions from those trips? And just to follow up on what Kevin mentioned earlier, a lot of countries kind of are in the middle right now, right, between the U.S. and China, and a lot of times they do not want to choose sides. What are those countries telling you as a senior, think tank person from New York?
Well, it's a big and a diverse region, so I'll have to generalize. And speaking of which, it's very important that the Asia Society is the Asia Society, not only the China Society. And we have a broad spectrum of programs, of engagements, of interests, and we deal with and look at China, assess and analyze China in the context of Asia, the Indo-Pacific, what's going on across the ocean. As a
sort of general matter, my semi-scientific soundings reveal a pretty broad-based consensus in the region that they would like to avoid thermonuclear war between Washington and Beijing. I'm pretty confident about that assessment.
That's a conservative judgment.
They're equally adamant about not seeing a G2 type condominium where China and the US are getting together, ganging up to rule the world. That doesn't seem like an imminent danger at this point. The business about not wanting to choose is not new. That's always been the case. The countries in the Indo-Pacific and Asia want to be dealt with and regarded and engaged in their own right, not merely as pawns on the chessboard of U.S. China rivalry. They want to be taken seriously. I'd say fundamentally they want the best of both worlds. They want a relationship with China that is profitable, that beneficial to them. They want China held in check to a certain degree by a robust U.S. and Western presence. They like having the U.S. and not merely the U.S. Seventh Fleet, but U.S. companies, the traditions of democracy and open markets, et cetera. This is a positive pressure. To know China is not necessarily to love China, particularly if their backyard is adjacent to yours, and the Chinese have border disputes with many of their neighbors. There is fierce competition over resources, water, fish, oil, hydrocarbons, you name it. So it's a tough neighborhood. And so having a certain degree of U.S. engagement, U.S. presence is very, very welcome. But very few countries are really committed to ensuring that the U.S. has absolute primacy over China. They know China. They've managed to coexist with China for now several millennia. And they don't appreciate it when American officials come riding through the region announcing the Chinese are coming, watch out, don't talk to them, don't do business with them. That doesn't work, that doesn't resonate, nor does, frankly, the autocracy versus democracy framework really work either, because there are precious few pure democracies in Asia. And honestly, what I hear is a great deal of skepticism about the US itself. Who is the US to be lecturing us? America, China, you're not as different from each other as you both think you are. So I guess the bottom line is they want the Goldilocks solution. They want us to treat them with respect. They want to make a good living off of their relationships with both of us, and they want us to lower the risk of conflict.
Right. This reminds me of a conversation I had with a econ official in Beijing recently. He was talking about China's application to join CPTPP, and he's very resigned to the fact that we're not going to be joining because the opposition from the United States. Irony is that the U.S. is not a member of that group anymore. And then he made a point about that is why we're trying really hard to upgrade RCEP, this regional trade agreement in the region. So it looks like China definitely is stepping up effort to courting partners in that region as well. After having coexisted peacefully for such a long time, they're trying to get them closer as well. But Danny, how do you think the current economic slowdown in China, which is making China a little bit weaker economically, if not in other areas, how do you think that is affecting China's ability to get partners in that region?
I don't see much indication that China's economic slowdown is creating problems in their bilateral relationships, political or economic, in Asia. it is certainly getting a lot of press from the Wall Street Journal and from other media sources.
Yeah, we're keeping at it.
And as Bill pointed out, there's a certain amount of schadenfreude in it. People glorying in the fact that the great Chinese juggernaut is slowing down. There's always been, as he says, a school of thought that held it was just a house of cards anyway, and so on. But it's not really perceptible yet, at least I think for most commercial and trade relationships. As the Chinese consumption sags, as China's need for inputs diminishes, yeah, that is going to lower trade numbers. That does have a downstream effect on many of its neighbors. On the other hand, the trend of decoupling or diversification is sending waves of investment, future-oriented investment, to countries like Vietnam, India, Malaysia, et cetera. So there is a silver lining for them in that respect. Well, the one place where I think we will be seeing an effect is in China's ability to invest overseas, particularly in the developing world, through whether it's through the Belt and Road Initiative or the Global Development Initiative, or even the modest amount of traditional foreign assistance that comes out of Beijing, because the state treasury isn't as, full of gold as it was a few years ago, and the bureaucrats are being compelled by the finance ministry, I think, to be much more careful. China wasted unfathomable sums of money in these white elephant boutique vanity projects in the developing world. And now the companies that are going to the China Development Bank or China Exim Bank for funding need to show that there really is a commercial viability to the project. They can't simply count on this bottomless pit of de facto risk insurance.
Just to add to what both Danny and Bill have said about the state of the Chinese economy, and also Gary's observations before in terms of his stable of Chinese companies with which he works, we actually just need a balanced view of where the Chinese economy is going. Point one, there are structural problems. A, demography. We're aware of that. Aging the population, all the consequential impacts on workforce size, etc. They're not Robinson Crusoe there either. B, there is a problem in terms of debt to GDP, but it's domestic debt to GDP. It's unlike what we've seen in other emerging economies around the world. But it is a constraint on public finance, as Danny just pointed out, and therefore the ability to recourse to classic Keynesian pump priming, as they've done in the past, is more constrained than it has been historically. 3, there is another structural problem, which is ideology, and that is Xi Jinping's ideological approach to the economy since the 19th Party Congress in 2017 has been more statist, less embracing of the private sector, qualitative debate between Gary and myself, whether it's the big guys, the middle guys, or others. But the bottom line is, if you look at the net impact on business confidence, consumer confidence, and investor confidence, as reflected in the usual measures, including private fixed capital investment, that's another structural problem. On the upside, this is still a country of untapped quantums of private domestic consumption, which when confidence is restored, is there to occupy a huge space in terms of becoming the next primary generator of economic activity. So the idea that we have assumed, sorry, not we, but that you see this emerging assumption in the commentariat that, driven a little bit by Schadenfreude, that China is therefore sliding in its economic performance in one direction alone is, as they say in the classics, premature. The Chinese system is also capable of policy correction. They have not successfully policy corrected so far, but they are capable of turning on a dime. If you don't believe that, look at what they did with zero COVID on the 6th of December last year. And furthermore, you have this underpinning, unrealised potential of private consumption still to be pulled through as a future growth driver in the economy. Will that happen? Not sure, not clear, but I think it's just unempirical to count the Chinese economy down to the count. I think this is too much populism. Americans, in my experience, and many around the world, have often assumed the Chinese economy is 12 foot tall or 4 foot tall. My experience is it's about 5'9" and still growing. Okay, America, by the way, is 6'2" and still pretty healthy. So,
Excellent. I love it. In fact, some of the points Kevin raised, you can read about them in the Wall Street Journal too. Bill, technology really is at the core of the U.S. China relationship. At the core of the U.S. China competition, unless you disagree. So we're wondering, how would you evaluate China's technological capabilities these days, and especially in the areas you are super familiar with? How does China stack up to the United States?
Well, a long time ago, sort of in the 20 years post-World War II, the government, particularly the military, was a significant leading-edge buyer of technology. And at least in the digital space, that's totally not true anymore. Cell phones and their components are a far bigger market. Desktop productivity is a far bigger market than all government technology spending. And the big R&D budgets, whether it's for AI or any digital thing, are completely outside of the government. And so the dynamic innovation in China and in the US is pretty amazing. China, things like TikTok, that is very innovative, and it creates competition, makes people think about things. In the medical space, China's not nearly at the US level, but the rate of progress, the amount of activity is very promising. And also, one thing about their healthcare system, they can't afford to spend like we do. And so they have to find more efficient ways to do things. And so these middle-income countries, China most prominently, but Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, Vietnam, all of them cannot follow the US path in terms of how healthcare is done. So that innovation is going to be fantastic, and it will both trickle up to rich countries for efficiency, and it will trickle down, which is where the Gates Foundation comes in, to take those innovations and try to get them to low-income countries as rapidly as possible. The US tends to think there's some state-of-the-art. I mean, AI is published. The 2017 Attention is All You Need, that was published. None of those people work for Google anymore. They're out, working for many different companies. So the notion when the greatest models are just almost the greatest models are being open sourced, the notion that the Chinese are behind on something, what does that mean? Go look at the chip that's in the latest Huawei phone. That's a perfectly, state-of-the-art chip. And that's partly the US did say to China, hey, in a future conflict, you should be able to make your own chips. And so they should thank us. We put them on notice that, give them enough time to be ready. I mean, it would have been so impolite to cut the chips off later. And now they know, they're doing what they need to do. So, whatever's in that small yard, you will get tens of billions of money flowing into a mix of government and private things, some of which will be successful, some of which will be not work. But, to say they'll never get, say, EUV, they will get EUV. Following in that path is not that hard. So the thing the US has that no other country has to nearly the same degree is that smart people from the entire world come here and work on tough problems, whether it's climate or health or software. And so we're not 100% of the innovation, but we aren't the 5% of the world's innovation, which is what we represent in population. We're closer, and it varies by domain, but somewhere near 50, 60% of innovation. That's mind-blowingly disproportionate. And it's because, smart people from Brazil, smart people from Europe come here. None of the Asian countries, put aside Australia, has become an intellectual melting pot where you find academics. Japan actually didn't do a good job on this. They have brilliant people, but it's almost entirely domestic. And so we have one structural advantage that will make us more the center of innovation. But the notion that there's some big gap, I don't understand what people are thinking. And the idea that you can prevent dual use things from being largely available, I don't fully understand how that works. And what you're going to do is isolate the United States. You're going to say to third parties, hey, are you on the world side of the game or the US side of the game? And most people will pick to be on the world side.
Great. Any of you disagree?
It's always fun when you get technologists in a room with folks who deal exclusively with geopolitics, because what I find is that this is an engagement of folks who speak foreign languages. That is, technologists are looking at a world of vast new potential, vast new problem-solving possibilities, and, as you've seen in the recent commentary, from time to time sober warnings where tech could take us in terms of humanity. Geopoliticians will have as their predisposition to define where a whole raft of security threats exist, therefore who we should not trust, therefore who we should not work with, and therefore how we should quarantine the international community. And so it's a little bit like Mars and Venus in getting these two worlds together, which is, by the way, why the previous presentation on ChatGPT and generative AI is so good, because these are, in fact, new technologies and disciplines which can be deployed to solve pre-existing long-standing geopolitical problems if we're creative about it. So I think what Bill has pointed to is areas of enormous positive growth potential. And if I look carefully and dispassionately, as the Chinese seek to do in comparing US national comparative advantage against Chinese national comparative advantage, in a piece of mathematics which they use in the center called 综合国力, comparative national power, they try to do what you just said cannot be done, which is, here's what we've got, here's what they've got, here's what their allies have got, and therefore where do we stand? And whether the US system does the same or not, I haven't been allowed in that secret room yet, Danny. But there are efforts to do this. But I wonder, this is where I speculate, in partial agreement with Bill, whether this is an exercise just fraught with conceptual impossibility, because the dynamics of comparative advantage and disadvantage are so fluid, and so much of the material is open source, that frankly, our calculation in static time today will be radically different in 2.5 years' time, or in 4.5 years' time, depending on which tech category we're looking at. Who will win the great AI race? Who will be the first to develop perfect AI-generated weapon systems which are capable of avoiding human agency while still retaining political control? I don't know the answer to that. So these two universes, the geopoliticians in Captain Gloom territory and the Captain Optimism territory, the technologists of the world, they need to go out more together and drink more.
So I would, a way to think about this, at least from the last 18 years when we've been spending a lot of time, 12 years in China and then back here, is when you look at comparative strength, and it's easy now, you talk about the US and China. The reality is, though, China's strength does not come from being stronger than the United States. It comes from being stronger and larger as a market than virtually every other country in the world. So if you're thinking about it from a policy perspective, Bill alluded earlier to the fact that what the Gates Foundation does is how do you improve healthcare, how do you improve agriculture, how do you improve education for the entire developing world, the next 3.5 to 4 billion people that don't have reliable access to electricity, don't have reliable access to education, et cetera. The U.S. role could be, if we decide to embrace it, and this is very much an Asia society role, is how do you level up everyone else? Because if you take that gap that exists today and you reduce that dramatically, by definition, the United States wins. If you think about it just between the US and China. Because China's strength, to me, comes from the fact that it is the next great power. So what we should do is we should try to reduce the gap between the great powers and everyone else. That should make for a better world. And that certainly is the original ethos of the Asia Society. And I think that it's not an easy thing to do, obviously, as Kevin with the geopolitical versus technologist. But technology can take us there, I think. But it's also hard to find in history, when was it technology, especially software, constrained? When was it actually held like, if you try to contain water, you put enough pressure on water, it's going to go where it's going to go. It's going to be a flood or it's going to wick up through the walls, but it's going to do what it's going to do. Technology to me is very much the same. So the idea that your policy base is around constraining technology or access to technology simply won't work. And it's a fallacy to try to pursue policies like that.
I think you can reasonably estimate the trajectory, the direction in which things are likely to go, and we have to anticipate and evaluate whether we want to live in that kind of a world. And one of the trends that Bill alluded to is the bifurcation of technological systems, and we've already seen the Belt and Road Initiative begin to mutate into the digital Silk Road, with a lot of pressure on standard-setting organizations with alternate systems that are not compatible, the growth of these smart cities and data centers and so on. And to the extent that we are deliberately or inadvertently creating incentives for the creation of a competing alternate system, say the Beidou satellite system versus GPS, we're setting the world up for a big set of schisms. Political blocks are one thing. These are technological blocks, and that has huge commercial as well as, I think, political and social ramifications. China is making a dramatic push to bolster its relationships with and its self-appointed leadership of the developing world, and that's not going so badly. So I think that it's incumbent on the West and on the United States to think ahead and think through the second and third order effects of some of our national security policies, again, with the question in mind, is this the kind of world that we want to wind up living in?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. And I can't be so selfish and monopolize the entire panel. So we'll leave some questions for the audience. Raise your hand. I was told, well, that gentleman in the back, in the jacket. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please. Yes, you. Do you have a mic? Yeah.
Here goes.
Thank you. I'm Tom Ward, a native Seattleite, but 25 years now in Shanghai. And I am here as on the way to Washington, D.C. as part of the American Chamber door knock. And so, Gary Rieschel, I want to take advantage of your wisdom and experience,
Oh, God.
and
This will be a
help us
short
with a
answer.
little bit of sage advice on how to approach the Gallagher gang and others on presenting the benefit of American business competing in China.
I find that the discussions with Treasury, Commerce, et cetera, are actually more valuable right now than the political mosh pit that we have in DC. So I probably wind up having had more what I'd call constructive discussions with administration officials in those various departments than I have with elected officials directly.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for your time and for being here. My name is Sam Cho. I serve as the Commissioner of the Port of Seattle here. I appreciate the robust discussion around China, but I obviously want to point out, as Daniel pointed out, that this is the Asia Society, so I thought I'd ask a question that goes beyond China, maybe tangential to China. But, I think about the old Wade and Gretzky quote, skate to where the puck is going, and we've talked a lot about that. And I wanted to get each of your thoughts on what countries in Asia excite you outside of China. When you think about the next 5 to 10 years, and you think about all that's happening as a result of perhaps what's happening in China, what countries excite you? Where should our attention be as business leaders, as politicians, and why?
Well, the Gates Foundation does a lot of work in Asia and a lot of work in Africa. And if you look in terms of human welfare with the health lens, the progress in Asia is really quite phenomenal. Putting aside China, whose health statistics have improved very dramatically since 1980, India, post-pandemic, is putting more money into health. There's a lot of very good improvements there. Indonesia's improved their health system pretty dramatically. Vietnam runs, actually, by some measures, the best health system in the world. Vaccine compliance, way that they have equity across different income levels. And, so in Asia, the default case is quite strong improvements in human welfare. India has a lot of companies like Serum, which is the biggest vaccine company. The biggest 3 vaccine companies by volume are all in India. By revenue, no, it's the Western countries, but that has to do with the very different unit price that they sell at, which part of the market they're in there. And, so we work, the Gates Foundation works super heavily. India is actually our biggest single engagement, followed by Nigeria. Pakistan is still challenging. Afghanistan is challenging. But most the rest of Asia is doing quite well on health delivery and health innovation.
Is the question about economic opportunity outside of China? Well, I'm always excited about Australia, but
You're paid to be
you're paid to be, yes. But apart from my day job, I largely reflect what Bill said. This is me wearing my analytical hat, which I've worn for many years. You can't go past where India may now go, looking at all the matrices. What Modi has done in terms of the digital payment system for poor people across the country, the elimination of middlemen and sort of simple financial transactions, boost to Indian domestic consumption. Some evidence now the Indian government has a national infrastructure development plan. And given the challenges of managing the Indian Federation, with state governments in India even more vociferous than those in this country, it's no small challenge. So India, up there, in terms of economic potential at scale. And the second one, to again reflect what Bill said, is our near neighbour in Australia, which is Indonesia. This country is quite remarkable. I remember as a junior woodchuck in the Australian Parliament being a parliamentary election monitor for their first new democratic elections in 1999, having suspended democratic elections in 1954. And so from 1999 to the present quarter of a century, we've had multiple peaceful transitions of power. Secondly, in the course of the last decade, economic growth bumping along at a reasonable clip. Thirdly, other progresses in terms of, let's call the broad social contract, as well as some improvements in public health. And given the scale of its population, I think it's very important to remain focused on Indonesia. The final point I'd make is, again, reflecting Bill's point, is Africa. The continent will have a population of 2 billion by the time we get into the 2030s, if you look at the demographic lines. And therefore, China understands that it's not just out for geopolitical votes through the Belt and Road Initiative as it extends across Africa. It sees Africa as a huge emerging consumer market, sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And despite all the problems associated with governance in the continent, despite all the problems with various elements of civil and political unrest, what China sees is 2 billion new consumers for what will be an alternative market for Chinese-generated product in the future, quite apart from a central element of China's long-term secure supply chains. So I would put it in that order. I really have nothing to add on that topic, just frankly. So.
I'd say follow the demographics. In Asia, you have a large number of countries with very youthful populations. Indonesia is an example, but the Philippines has 100 million people. Vietnam, almost 100 million people. They both have relatively stable governments. They've got good education systems. There's phenomenal opportunity. You can even look and see Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, other countries that are hampered by political instability, political problems, or in the case of one of them, the lack of instability. These will not last forever. So it's a little bit like, looking for a green light. Once you start looking, you start seeing it everywhere. There's phenomenal opportunity throughout the Indo-Pacific, and I think that the Pacific Islands beyond Australia, and also South Asia.
We're a very big island.
Here too, there's a wealth of opportunity.
I really wish that someone from the Chinese government should be listening to what you just said, because
they were.
There has been a certain amount of hubris in China. They think outside China, in Asia, there's not too many opportunities, but in fact, there's so many opportunities. That lady in the left, right.
Hi, Michelle Goldberg. I'm also a venture investor, and I've worked with Gary for many years, and I believe that technology is like water. But is that true of the semiconductor industry as well? And what are the implications for Taiwan, and how you would answer that question?
Well, just the amount of capacity at TSMC, at the state of the art is absolutely gigantic. And even with the incentives that come from the CHIPS Act here in the US, TSMC is not talking about putting any more than 12% of their capital budget into the United States. And so in terms of the way we make chips today, it's going to be a long time before you'd even have half of Taiwan capacity outside of Taiwan. Now, because of this geopolitical stuff, a huge amount of capital has gone in, U.S., Europe, Japan, and China. And so we will drive to a position of great overcapacity in the chip industry because the investments are not being driven by market-based signals. The U.S. can get to the point where the chips we need for defense industry in particular can be made domestically. Weirdly, we're actually not in that position right now, but given another 4 or 5 years, you can get to that. But that's in terms of the world economy and its need for chips, that's a pretty small percentage. There are people always trying to come up with new approaches to take this ASML EUV approach and do it differently. Whether or not that will succeed, who knows? But that paradigm, you can predict where the capacity is going to be, and it says that it's mostly going to be in Taiwan for the rest of this decade.
I would say the only thing I would add is when we look at where capital is going in the region, venture capital, and particularly venture capital from within the region to other countries in the region, I was quite surprised. Nearly 45% of new startups funded in Vietnam were funded with Taiwanese capital. I did not expect that. I expected that to be mainland Chinese money. And that's something that some folks have been doing a study on. So I would expect that a lot of the ancillary businesses, I think the core fab and these core technology areas are where, as Bill mentioned, that's where you have to have massive capital. And even if you start today, it's a decade before you're going to have any impact. But I think there's a lot of businesses and also services businesses around the semiconductor industry that it looks like the Taiwanese are hedging. And it looks like they're starting to create, operations in other places. It's early, but the trend has been quite dramatic in the last 18 months.
And the Taiwan semiconductor industry is starting to run low on headroom for growth. Just the amount of water that the industry consumes is a physical limit on how far they can grow. So they are diversifying in the supply chain, as Gary points out. The biggest fallacy that I encounter is the assumption among many that to get ahead on semiconductors, you need to build a fab, and that's it. But the fab is just the shell. It's just a factory. What you really need is an ecosystem that's populated with tremendously skilled workers, not just the PhDs who are doing the science of silicon, but also the plumbers and the carpenters and the construction workers who are trained and capable of executing the work. That's no mean feat. And Taiwan has assembled a really extraordinary ecosystem that is so far been impossible for others to truly replicate.
The final point here, I think, is I'd be fascinated to finally see the backstory on Huawei's new chip, given all the public policy settings we've seen over the last 5 years. Furthermore, where that leads us in an analysis of the gap, Bill's earlier term, in terms of nanometers between China, SMIC, TSMC, and the rest in the next 5 years. This will be fascinating to observe. And I don't know if we've got a clinical answer to that question.
Very unfortunately, I was told to have to wrap up this panel. And thank you so much for your participation. And please give each of our panelists a round of applause.
Thank you again to our panel. We're going to take a few photos here. First facing forward, then we're going to do one backwards. And we'll do a serious one, and then everyone in the audience, if you can take a moment and wave, you'll be in the background of this next one here. Thank you so much, Mr. Gates, Kevin Rudd, Daniel Russel, Lingling Wei, and Gary Rieschel.